Welcome to my artist talk. My name is Katie Marie Bruce. I'm based in Lethbridge, Alberta, and this is the studio space that I've been using for the last 4 years, give or take a couple of months in there. It's a very DIY little space at Casa, which is our community arts center. It's also the place that I call my full-time job, where I am the education services manager. So doing a lot of programming, birthday parties, workshops, all those fun things. That's sort of my 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. And then through the weekend, this is generally where you can find me. I've decided to structure my artist talk today by basically taking everyone along with me on a couple of standard studio days. So I hope that this is enjoyable. I'm going to talk a lot about process and materiality because I nerd out fairly hard when it comes to paper. I hope you enjoy. So Casa is a community arts center, which does mean that on occasion I will be interrupted during the videoing of this, speaking with other studio members, helping out, those kinds of things. I'm very sentimental about this press bed, which is kind of an interesting space for me. When I was at the University of Lethbridge, this was actually the first press that I got to print on. And it was really heartwarming when I returned in the summer of 2016 to Lethbridge to do a month-long artist residency. And when you pull back the blankets and you see the very familiar marks, there was something just very comforting about returning there and seeing these familiar sort of impressions. So I wanted to just give thanks to this press and to the university for donating it to Casa, because it sure is a workhorse. So as you can see here, the plate that I'm working on is quite off-centered. And the reason that I've decided on that is not necessarily due to, well, it is compositional. But not in the traditional sort of way. So what I'm going to be demoing / talking my way through today is a double-sided image, meaning that I'm printing on both the front side and the back side of a piece of Gampi and then Shin Claying it to a backing paper, in this case BFK Reeves. So some of what I do sort of to prepare to work with a double-sided image is I complete a digital mock-up first to ensure that I have enough space on the plate for both components to coexist without overprinting on top of one another. In this particular instance, I set it up so that just one little tiny piece of the image would touch once the mirroring was complete. So I'm going to take you through just sort of some of my fun tips, bad habits, all those fun things that happen in the studio when you really don't get to, when you kind of are self-taught. So printmaking to me, it was something that I fell into quite naturally, but also as a shock to myself. When I was at the University of Lethbridge doing my BFA, I really truly thought that I was going to be an abstract painter, and that was going to be the life for me. I had run out of painting classes to take. I'd run out of photography courses to take. I had zero interest in sculpture at that time. I'd also run out of drawing classes, and a friend had suggested that, well, maybe ahead of taking studio arts, we could try a printmaking class. And I didn't know what printmaking was, and didn't really approach it in a serious manner, because again, I had no idea. And this particular class was printmaking without a press, so we weren't doing etching, but once I started to kind of wrap my head around what the potential of print was, I fell deeply in love. Even just the act of taking an impression, taking an embossing, seeing the way the paper was really receptive to all these kinds of marks I didn't know were possible in other mediums. And then when I went to York University to do my master's degree, I was suddenly the graduate assistant in an etching class, having never taken it before. So I was learning, alongside my students, which is an interesting kind of space to cohabit. One of expected expert as well as true beginner. But I think pretty quickly within the etching process, I realized how much it had to give in terms of philosophical space, how unforgiving it was in terms of manipulating the material. And it really did just become something that I found myself gravitating toward. So here you can start to see the image that I'm working with, which is that of the vagus nerve. It is responsible for a lot of our reactions to things. This is going to sound fairly preliminary because it is something that I'm just really starting to get into. But I like to think of it as the nerve that travels from your ear down into your gut and then comes back up sort of a similar channel towards your tongue. So it is really, it's responsible for sort of those moments where you hear something, your body reacts, and then you're not able to vocalize something. It's that information highway that we have within our body. And I think it's a pretty rich space to kind of work within. I wanted to work with this particular image for the purpose of this artist talk / demo / studio day, because it's one where this is another returning. So following my graduation from my MFA program, I was kind of in that space of wondering, okay, so, well, what happens next? Where do I go? What do I do? And where is my practice going to go? Because I kind of had felt, I had started moving more in towards human bodies and thinking about the human body. And it happened that I was starting to read about breath. Breath was something that breathing is something that I have a bit of a fraught relationship with. Growing up, there were many times when I was unable to breathe, and sometimes depending on how that day was going, I was also unable to move. And when I would bring this up with doctors, it was frequently sort of pushed aside. I was told to, breathe through the pain. I was told to stretch it out. And those answers were just never satisfactory, because this was a thing that no one else could see, but that was very real to my experience. So, you just reset after your MFA program and you start thinking about the things that you innately know. And one of them, for me, was knowing that I wanted to return to my breath. And part of that was, learning about different breathing techniques, thinking about how I personally work through those moments of not being able to breathe, and, you know, just starting to really investigate it. In the video here, right now, you can see me starting to work with the actual Gampi that I'm going to be printing on. What I'm doing with my hands there is stretching it taut against the surface, because it is a very fine paper that I'm working with. It's, you know, 16 grams for 24 by 39 inch sheet. So to say that it is a feather, it would be a tad of an exaggeration. So making sure that I'm smoothing out all the possibilities for wrinkles is super important for this particular process. Yeah. So as we're going to see here in a moment, we're just going to jump towards that first reveal. I was lucky with this plate, I'm not going to lie. There weren't any revisions I had to make. There wasn't anything standing out that I needed to address, and I was able to fully move basically from this proof here that you're about to see into editioning the rest of the prints. So as you can tell, like, how I'm handling this paper, it is incredibly delicate. I mean, you can see not only the full impression of my hand behind the paper, but also even the detail of my ring. And one of the things that's incredibly important for this process is to ensure that my plate tone is like impeccable across the entirety of the plate, because I really don't have the option of hiding any mistakes, because it is such a minimal image, right? It's just line work. There's no background tone. There's a couple incidental plate marks that we're going to find here in a couple of moments, or I guess which will be revealed in the full editioning once we actually start to see things and how they stack up against one another. But so one of the things that I'm, I guess, trying to make a point of in this video is the necessity of body memory, that ability for knowing exactly how far to push a plate when you're wiping it, when to transition from sort of a rougher touch into a more delicate one, and relying on sort of that internalized body knowledge that I have while making things about the body. There's definitely a lot of doubling and layering, both in the print process that I'm working with as well as in the imagery, and I take great pleasure in all of those tiny little poetic moments that I can't avoid. So here I've obviously started the next print, trying really hard to fall back on that body memory, to wipe the plate in the same sort of manner throughout the whole process, so that while I'm doing 7 right now, when I redouble that, and in order to do the reverse side of the paper, I really have that body memory piece down. So this was a process that I kind of stumbled upon when I was actually in my residency in 2016. At the time, I was working, as I had mentioned, with breathing. So the piece that I had been called towards making was this one of 2 lungs with an asymmetrical component. So printed on the front and the back, but on the back side of the print, I'd placed a small little pit sort of in the lower right hand corner of the paper, indicating sort of where that pain that I could feel was. That project kind of took on this whole, well, it was truly an attempt to visualize where these sensations were within me, so that, you know, on the off chance that I could get a doctor that would pay attention, that would listen to what I was saying, I would have something to back up the idea that I was experiencing this sort of life-stopping pain, and give a visual language to. And that has more or less been my task, a little bit extrapolated out from just breathing, but the task of trying to understand and put a visual language to the experience of having a body, whether that is a feminized body or one in pain, or where those two things overlap. As I had mentioned earlier, being an incredibly anxious individual, there were lots of body sensations that I could fall back on throughout this process, and really start to investigate, like, okay, so what does the knot in my throat look like? What does the knot in my stomach look like? What about when I'm not experiencing one breathing pain, but I'm experiencing two, and they're simultaneous, but they feel like there's a space between them? What does a swarm feel like to me? Like when you are so overcome with feeling and everything just kind of moves and shifts. What is it that is? And through my artist residency at Casa in 2016, I produced something silly like 10 editions of images, some of which I had come prepared with, and others which kind of appeared in one way or another while I was doing other work. One of my favorite things about being in the studio is the way that everything kind of starts to flow into one another. It's very rare for me to work on one piece at a time, because so often there are these tiny little tangents that want to get pulled into a project. And while they can't necessarily be facilitated in the print that's being made, that's where the notebook comes in. That's where you really return to your processes of documentation and starting to work through an image. And for me, that is the notebook. Like I rarely draw out an idea. It's much more accurate to say that I will write out something and allow it to evolve and sort of sit on the back burner of my mind until there comes a point where it's like there's a window in sort of what I'm working on that allows me to really get into a new project, a new tangent of this work that is so uniquely tied up in the body. So what you're seeing here is just me preparing the next sheet. I work with a damp pack, but I often do find that it's necessary just to get a little bit of that sort of residual water that sits on the surface of the paper off, which is the paper towel that you saw me sort of making a nice little sandwich out of. This process to me is one of not only body memory, but also of ritual. So setting oneself up for the day, for like the whole day worth of printing. I'm not good at doing small stints of prints. So I guess here's more evidence here for you that everything is printing out fairly okay. I think one of my favorite things in filming this process was getting to see just how dirty my hands got. I mean, I'm pretty aware of it when I'm actually in the studio and printmaking, but to sort of see the small evolution of print by print, that process of slowly getting the ink marks on the back of my hand due to pulling my gloves off in a certain way. There's something kind of enjoyable about that. Every so once in a while in this video, you'll see me look down at my watch, and what I'm actually doing is changing the music that's playing in my ears. When I'm in the studio, I have a really hard time with silence, and I find that it's a lot easier to get into that sort of body memory moment if I have music of a similar pace playing in my ears. I'm not necessarily timing how I'm wiping the plate to what's going on in my headphones, but there definitely is a relationship that's going on there. So I suppose I would need to thank maybe like Tom Petty and Mariah Carey simultaneously for being somewhat of a musical inspiration through this process that I filmed. So here is a little love note to this paper. I really wanted to be able to highlight just how special it is and its unique properties. So as I mentioned, it's a very light sheet for how big it is. It's very transparent. It's a handmade paper. It's called Inshu Gambi 001, and I got it from the Japanese paper place, which is based now in Etobicoke. But when I first fell in love with it, it was based in Toronto, and I was working there. So to say that I've had my fair share of paper that I've been able to sort of test out and see and push the possibilities of would be an understatement. But this is definitely my favorite one that I've come across. There's something very satisfying about this sort of like high crinkle sound that it gives off when it's in this particular state. And the fact that it's pretty difficult to tell the front side from the back side doesn't hurt either. So this is print number 7 that you are sort of seeing taking place right now. This will be an edition of 7. There's only one that I've kind of finished at this point, but that is the goal at the end of the day. And I just kind of wanted to show you that the printing hasn't evolved as I've kind of gone through this process today. So more or less where I started and how I started the first plate really truly is how I'm wiping this last one for the day, and making sure that I'm paying particular attention to the overall plate tone, to that sort of background area, and making sure that there's no accidental tone that's going to be transferred and left on there going forward, because as much as a little bit of plate tone is nice, if it becomes very obvious and distracting when I'm working with both sides of that Shin Claying paper, when there are discrepancies in how it's been wiped and how it's been handled. So consistency in printmaking is always key, but in this particular process, there is no greater king than consistency. What you can kind of see at this angle is where the difference is between where it has been fully wiped versus where there's still some cloudiness on the plate. And really truly that mirror polish is so key in successfully pulling off this visual trick, because that is at the end of the day what it is. This mirroring is not a natural thing for this paper, I think, to do, probably for printmaking to do, but it is something that I find deeply satisfying when I do pull off. And while it looks like I'm quite vigorously using that tissue paper. There is a very gentle touch that I'm using here, because if I'm pulling out too much ink from any of those lines, it's going to be very obvious when it's placed next to the same image. So all of those things that we so carefully take into consideration as printmakers is really just doubled upon in this process. I'm using a cotton makeup pad actually to do my edges. And while it doesn't completely remove like all of that tone, it does do a pretty good job in terms of removing the majority of it and just giving me a gentle sort of shadow to work with when I end up aligning both the front side and back side image up. Gotta love that mirror polish. That's some good stuff. There's that dirty hand that I was talking about, and print number 7. So here you can see a little bit more in detail sort of that paper aligning technique. I try and place my fingers at each of the corners and then pull from there, and then follow up with sort of this gentle fawning, I guess, touch, where I'm just moving the edges very, very, very subtly. And that, again, of course, is going to be very important in the printing of the back side of this paper, but it's equally as important to ensure that there's no wrinkles, no creases that accidentally show up in that first side. You'll notice that so here's a bad habit, I suppose, that I've picked up. I don't generally wipe the acetate that's on the press bed while I'm creating an image. And the reason for doing that is a little bit superstitious. I'm worried about wiping away the good juju from the previous prints. So here you can kind of see what that alignment is going to look like. This is just the print from the previous section, just laid over top of an already printed plate. So you can kind of really appreciate sort of the detail, the varied line weights that are being used, and also those kind of gentle incidental marks that I'm going to make use of at one point in time. Now this plate here has actually been already wiped. I thought that maybe you didn't need to see that process again. But this is what that lining up is going to look like. So you can see here that the edges of the first print, which is now top side up, you can see in the video, and I'm working my best to very gently shuffle this paper across the surface of the plate so that those edges align as best as possible with the plate that's underneath. So that's sort of what I've called a fawning touch, where I'm very gently just kind of like moving the very edges of the paper in just a hope to shuffle it like 1 to 2 millimeters over. And then that first grand reveal moment when you've got both sides in action. It's always funny like watching these videos back because I don't realize how often I pause to take a breath. And there was definitely a moment there, and there's another one later on in the video which is incredibly visible. But just the ability for print to kind of make you press pause. So despite how I'm handling this paper, it is very delicate, but it has an incredible wet strength, which really just goes to show that quality handmade paper is unbeatable. Just a nice little still image here for you of the print, both front side and back side. So in this particular image, the top portion was the one that was facing up. I think it's fairly difficult by the end of this process to truly see which is front and which is back. That's more of a thing when I'm working with aquatint, where you can start to understand sort of that tucking away that happens. So I have pushed this paper before beyond just a front side, back side. I've done front side, back side, and folding with it. I won't get into a folded Shin Claying with this particular set, but it is a thing that I also am very passionate about. There's something that makes me feel like a bit of a smartass sometimes when I find these tricks that I can pull off. There's a novelty that I really enjoy, but there's also always sort of a purpose behind what I've done. So here you'll get a little bit of a better sense as to the front side, back side relationship. You can see there that I'm using, it's really just sort of the middle area here. That's the only part of the image that overlaps. There's two nerves that kind of create a nice little gentle arc. And those are the only ones that have any overlap within the image. Everything else is separate. And everything else is just purely mirrored. So what that means is that all the incidental marks, the little plate cutting accident at the bottom there, those are all perfectly mirrored across from one another. And what I was really thinking of when I was starting to pull this image together was the idea of bodies in communication with one another. So those sort of hidden conversations that we're having, not even being conscious of what is actually taking place. So that moment where those two nerves create an arch and move from one body into the next body, really thinking about pulling us into conversation, how we activate one another, what's going on when we are suddenly feeling activated, because one of the wonderful things that this nerve does is kind of translate our trauma responses from throughout our body. So it is always in conversation, whether or not there is another physical body present. It's still relying on sort of another body memory, right? That more of that history of how I've interacted with others before and what is currently informing my response at this moment. So here you can see that fawning touch being taken. And this is the last of the double-sided prints being filmed here. When I was filming this shot, just a little kind of side piece here. When I was filming this shot, I was forced to kind of think about how critical I was of this piece by Fred Hagen, where this woman is straddling a lithography press and pulling up a print. And of course, she's nude, and both the printmaker and some sort of form of assistant are in the room, and they're both clothed. And I was just struck with how critical I was about how ridiculous it was that anyone would climb on a press in order to pull up a print. And yet, here I was doing just that same thing. So now with all of the printing actually done, I'm going to get into trimming one of the prints down. This is on day 2 of being in the studio, so there was time between the front side and the back side printing in order for that ink to cure a little bit more, because if I attempted to do it on the same day, I would end up with losing a lot of that residual ink that hadn't yet cured. When I trim my prints, I use what I'm sure is probably the wrong side of a ruler. The reason that I do this is that in case there are any uncured moments on the print, I'm actually able to wipe that off and prevent it from transferring onto other areas while I'm trimming the rest of the pieces down. And then in between each cut, I'm using a cotton pad to just remove any kind of residue. These were both very dry by the time I started cutting them, so that wasn't necessarily a problem. But as a somewhat superstitious printmaker, which I feel like there are a lot of, it felt like something that I needed to go through the motions of in order to, not jinx myself. Now, if you've noticed here, after I start every cut, I'm using my forefinger of the hand holding the ruler to pull taut the top corner of the paper, and that is to prevent it from bunching up while I'm cutting it, because the last thing I want to do after I've gone through this arduous process of printing front side and back side is to end up with a jagged edge. Similar to how I don't like removing ink from the press bed acetate in between each print, I like to sort of grandfather in my Shin Claying glue. That might be one of those bad habits that I've picked up. But as you can kind of see here, I'm starting to reincorporate some new Yamato rice paste in the sort of concentrated form into the rest of the water. I've got a couple of different brushes that I'm going to use throughout this process. The one that I'm currently using is a small goat hair brush. Another item that I've picked up from the Japanese paper place. And really what I'm doing here is making sure that there are no sort of lumps within it, so trying to strain it as best as possible just by the process of kind of squeegeeing it against the inside of the container. You'll notice there that I also have a small, a finer brush to the side, and that's going to be for kind of mistakes found later. Here I'm just sort of removing some stray hairs that had fallen off. So when I'm doing my Shin Claying, I'm using this wide brush to add water to a dry piece of paper. I prefer to do it that way rather than spray the water and let the paper expand. It just gives me a bit more control. I mean, to each their own, but that's how I found works best for me. Of course, in the filming of this, it did slide a little bit, and so there's some repositioning that needs to be done, which is another reason why it's important to have that wet strength in the paper. And then just starting to take off sort of that excess water, making sure there's not too much sitting on top of the plate. That's then going to change how that ink is going to hold on to it. None of that. I'm not about risk taking when it comes to Shin Claying. So after sort of a final look over to see how this is sitting, if there's any wrinkles I need to address, one or two couple extra swipes over with this wide brush in order just to make sure everything is sealed down nicely. And then using the same glue brush, but just the edge. I don't want any extra on there, and I work from the outside, or from the inside, sorry, of the print towards the outside, going in both directions, similar to how I applied the ink to the plate initially. And then much in the same way that I removed the excess water, doing the same thing with a little bit of clean paper towel and just doing what I think of as like piano fingers across the surface of it. Just a very delicate touch to remove any of that excess. Now, for the purposes of Shin Claying, I often use the other side of the the plate that I've been printing with. So it's just a little, that's probably also a bad habit, let's be quite honest. So I've got my registration sheet here. None of this is probably very new to anybody, but I figured that it was best to kind of follow through the whole process. So just sort of very delicately realigning the plate onto the registration sheet and ensuring that everything that I want to be there is in the spaces that it is. Another piece of that paranoia / superstitious piece of me is that I will always mark the top of the registration sheet as well as the deckled edge and where the plate is going to be, just to make it as foolproof as possible, because even though this is a process that I've done at this point hundreds of times, there's always the potential for a mistake. While I have zero poetic waxings on about the necessity of removing excess water from your backing paper, it's still a thing that needs to happen. So here we go. I'm not especially worried about how long this process takes, because the paper will still be damp enough to reactivate any of the glue that's dried on the actual back of the print. So I can kind of take my time making sure and examining each side of the paper to ensure that there's no blinding spots of water remaining. And then in sort of rolling the paper here, I'm able to align what I've called the tongue of it, which is the top edge, along the registration sheet in order to best align it to what's happening below. But I also have the option of repositioning the paper from the side if necessary, which, let's be honest, I generally have to do. You can see in the background there's the other 6 prints that are waiting for this process to happen to them. I won't be going over that with this particular video. I figured one Shin Claying demo was probably enough for all y'all, but wanted to ensure that you get this wonderful sort of reveal moment that, I don't know about you, but does cause me a little level of anxiety, which you're about to see in that giant breath that I just had to take in order to pull that off and inspect it properly. So here is the sort of final product. It's still wet. I will need to tape it down, but this does give me a pretty good preview into what is happening there. And then the stretching process. I prefer to tape my prints down primarily because that's how they taught it at York University. I've also seen sort of the detriment of not taping down a Shin Claying and how warbly it can get. And for me, I'd rather take this sort of extra step in order to make sure that everything is as flat as possible, because even though this is kind of a finishing move or maybe something that students might think of as mostly performative, there are some real benefits, I think, to taping down versus stacking between wet newspaper. I go over all of my edges multiple times in order to ensure that that baby is stuck down as best as possible. And again, kind of try to work in a fairly methodical method in order to ensure the best adhesion possible. At the beginning of this stage, I think you might have seen me sort of point towards the edges which had started to lift. And once I've got, a little bit of dryness around that edge, once it's just cool to the touch but not necessarily damp, that's when I know it's time to actually start this process of burnishing the tape down. I am using a filament tape. It will draw up some fibers, which is why I'm working on the back side of the print, because I don't really want to compromise the pristineness of the front side of it. And then as kind of a finishing move, I like to run my burnisher along the very edge where the paper is going to actually meet against the board. Sometimes I find that is just that one extra piece of preparatory work that really pays off in the end. And now I'm going to let it set for 24 hours, but I'm not going to put you through it. When I'm pulling up the tape, this is purely process at this point, but I do so at a very sheer angle. I find that means I'm removing less of the paper fibers that are left behind, or left on the tape, sorry, and it definitely tends to assist in making sure that no corners accidentally get damaged. But here is the final piece. So I just wanted to thank you for joining in for Prairie Impressions. I wanted to thank both the directors of SNAP and AP for asking me to be part of this process, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the demos and talks.